Hi, so this is Tim Robinson with hopefully a fairly brief video about ethics in research as it applies to your action research project. It's worth saying that if you've already filled in your ethics form and it's been approved, you've had the go-ahead, that's fine. Nobody's saying you need to fill in another form, but there are things about the form that kind of need some clarification. So I think it's well worth just watching the video so that we're all kind of starting in the same place with this. So one of the learning outcomes on the module is that you conduct your research in an ethically sound fashion. So I think it's worth trying to be very clear about what that actually is. So we're suggesting three elements. First of all, respect for others, and when we say others we mean in this situation particularly your students, but also other tutors, perhaps people outside of BIM, anybody basically that you're kind of bringing into the project. So acting with respect for them. Secondly, setting out to do good and not harm, of course. And thirdly, acting fairly towards everybody who's involved. Okay, so as far as the first of those is concerned, you need to get informed consent from everybody who's taking part. So your participants must be told in a way that they can understand what is it about, what's the point of the project, what's their role in it, and what is their data going to be used for. And you can reassure them that you will be storing their data securely and then disposing of it once the project is finished. Participants must agree to take part voluntarily, so no arm twisting. They must be treated with respect, obviously, and it must be made clear that they can withdraw at any time. So if they start to feel uneasy with the way this is going, or they change their minds, that's fine. You can pull anything that they've said or done out of the information that you've collected, produced, whatever. It's worth saying that the kind of default setting for a project like this should be that participants will remain anonymous. I can imagine that there might be situations where it's important that we know who your participants are, and if you can explain why that is and get consent from them, that's fine, but as I say, the default setting should be that participants are anonymous. It's also important to say that the word research can make people think, ooh, it must be about proving things and doing experiments on people. Well, we just need to emphasise that we're not actually doing experiments on kind of test subjects. We're working with other people to try to improve our practice. In terms of the informed consent, it's worth also saying that your students, you are still their teacher, so you don't need permission from your students to teach them in a way that you think will be beneficial. So second element to this, setting out to do good and not harm. So you do need to have an assessment of the risks, potential risks and potential benefits of the research for everybody who's taking part, and of course potential benefits must outweigh potential risks. You're trying to improve things and not to make them worse. It's also worth saying that you as a researcher need to be aware of kind of protecting yourself from potentially confrontational or violent people, or putting yourself at any kind of risk. So consider your own well-being as well as that of everybody else who's involved. I have seen projects where people are actually putting themselves in quite scary situations for the sake of research. Don't do that. So protect yourself as well as everyone else. Acting with fairness. So this basically means in our context that some participants should not be exposed to more risk or more benefits than others. So everybody must be treated equally and fairly, and the researcher should not try to privilege one group over another. So for example, if you're teaching 4 classes the same subject, it can be tempting to think, okay, well, I'll try my exciting new intervention with 2 groups and then leave 2 groups as they were. But that in fact is unfair, in the sense that some groups may benefit or suffer from your intervention. Unfortunately, we can't do that, so you have to move all your students forward together, and if that means your research is slightly less convincing because you don't have a control group, so be it. So you can't privilege one group over another in what you're doing. So those are our 3 kind of basic elements, and you demonstrate your ethical approach by filling in an ethical review form before you start. And as I say, a lot of you already have. But the point of it is that it allows us to double check whether your project is low risk, in which case we can say yes, fine. And if we think it's high risk, if we're not sure that we like the look of what you're planning, there is an ethical approval committee at BIM which will look over it and say yes or no, or suggest some alterations for making it, ethically sound. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, in terms of interviews, focus groups, and questionnaires, the assumption is that you will be giving individual participants consent forms to read and to complete. As for class observations and videos, we'll be talking about that in a minute, and there is some detail about that on the research methods information sheets, which are on the blog. So if we look at the form itself, all right, here it is. First page is basically self-explanatory. Second page is important. So about the project, this is where you explain what it's all about, and in particular, you explain what you're going to be doing, as it were, with your participants. So this is quite important because it makes it, clear to us what it is that you're planning and the ethical implications of that. A3, risk checklist. So that's quite important. I think it's fair to say covert observation, except in extreme circumstances, would be best avoided. Question 2, will the study involve discussion of sensitive topics? Well, that's kind of debatable, isn't it? So it's up to you to be honest and open here and then explain what you mean in the box below. Question A4 is all fairly straightforward. Question A5 is where things start to get a bit spooky. So, question 1, will all respondents be given an information sheet and adequate time to read it? You kind of need to say yes to that. Question 2, however, is a bit more complicated. So it says, will all participants taking part in an interview, focus group, observation or other activity which is not questionnaire based be asked to sign a consent form? So clearly the sort of default setting for that question would be to say yes. But it's a bit more complicated than that. So it seems to me, if you're doing an interview or a focus group, you do need to give a written consent form to be signed. If you're doing a questionnaire, you can make it clear on the questionnaire itself that filling in the questionnaire and returning it, amounts to consent for you to use their information. However, as far as an observation is concerned, it gets more complicated. So basically, this issue has been up in front of BIM's Ethical Approval Committee, and the sort of judgment that has come down is that a standard lesson observation, where you are observing your own lesson in the process of teaching it, or you are sitting in on somebody else's lesson and seeing what goes on, or somebody else is coming into your lesson to observe what's going on, that's absolutely fine. So we don't need formal written consent for a standard lesson observation. This is part of daily life at BIM and at any other higher education college. What we do need specific written consent for is filming. So I'm a big fan of filming lessons. I think it's a really useful thing to do. But the latest, judgment from the approval committee is that if you're going to do that, you need to give a participant consent form to all the students who are in the room. You need to get them to read it, and you need to get them to sign it and return it to you. So the best advice is that we do that the week before filming. So you hand out a form to all the students who are in the room, get them to just spend a couple of minutes, check it over, and hopefully say yes. And then on the week of actual filming, if there's a handful of extra students, it's not going to be too disruptive to the filming to actually get them to fill in the form and sign it. What you do if they all say yes is great, you can go ahead and film. If some people say no, then you have a tricksy situation on your hands. So it seems to me there may still be some ways around it. You might be able to say, I'm going to film this side of the room, and if you would rather not be included in my video and you have said so on the form, you can sit over there. Kind of starts to feel a bit like the naughty corner, doesn't it? But there may also be a way of using a camera angle that focuses on you rather than on your students. So if you're particularly interested in what you do as a teacher, you might not actually need to be seeing the students at the same time as making a video of yourself. So there may be some ways around it, but that is the sort of ethical situation as far as making videos of your class are concerned. Okay. So that's A5. The rest of the questions I think are fairly straightforward. And as usual, it's basically about being, open and honest about what you're planning and then explaining why you're planning it. And as I say, the point of this is so that we can look at it and go, yeah, that looks fine, or we're not quite sure, in which case we sort of pass it up the chain of command and the Ethical Approval Committee gives it the once over. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. At the end of the form is the participant consent form, and that first little phrase is important. This form is a template and is adaptable as appropriate, so you do need to do a bit of editing on this depending on whether you're doing interviews or focus groups or indeed filming. So, and the little box at the back, summary of the research project, that's for the benefit of your participants so that you can explain what it's all about and what their role in it might be. Okay, so any issues with ethical consent, do write to myself or to Jerry, and hopefully that video has been helpful.